Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome to my review of Wargroove. This is a game which a friend has been pestering me to play for a while now, and in his defense, the sales pitch was a good one, namely that it's a fantasy version of Advance Wars. When I was growing up, I seldom played anything outside of the few games we had for PC, but the Game Boy Advance was the exception, offering my brother and I a means to pass the time during long road trips. Naturally, this included Advance Wars 1 and 2. Which made for really fun turn-based strategy games that were easy to learn but could throw a solid challenge in parts of the campaign and some of the war room scenarios. And luckily for me, back then technology was built to last, meaning while their battery life isn't all that great anymore, they still work just fine, meaning if I ever want to feel old, it's nice to dig them out every once in a while, if only to compare them to what we have now. Even then, however, I held off on buying it because I hadn't played Advance Wars or a game like it in years, meaning in the back of my mind there was a concern that after having gotten used to modern-day Fire Emblem, I would find Wargroove lacking. Still, there's nothing like a Steam sale to make one change its tune, and since I had made a sufficient dent in my backlog, I decided to check it out, and immediately regretted pulling the trigger, not because the game was bad, but because now I didn't have plausible deniability for why my last video took so long to make. Yeah, I got addicted to it. So now that I've thrown way more time at it than is probably healthy, let's justify that by telling you why it was worth it. Since the story is given a significant focus at the start, let's follow its lead. The game begins with the King of Cherrystone mulling over a secret that he feels must be told to his daughter Mercia, up until he's rudely interrupted with a reminder that he's the parent of the protagonist. The unwelcome intrusion comes from an agent of the undead kingdom of Felheim, who demands information about some kind of key. Naturally, he would sooner die than give up the secret, sparking a war between the two kingdoms. Thus, you take on the role of Mercia, as she's forced to defend her homeland against the relentless undead. It's a solid premise that's executed fairly well, but it's not without issue. The main problem is that the tone is wildly inconsistent. The game starts out deadly serious, talking about the tragedy of the war, of loss, of desperation, and you really feel for Mercia given the situation she finds herself in. It sets a strong foundation for the characters and gives them room to shine as the story progresses. But then you look across at the character pursuing her, as you get the feeling she's gonna be a tough opponent. After all, she's an undead amalgamation of numerous renowned warriors from ancient history, so clearly she'll be a major threat. Up until you realize that she's more of a comic foil, because when it comes to actual combat, even the most basic strategy will trip her up, which is made worse by the fact that she's carrying so much impotent rage that you could substitute her for your average Twitter user and I wouldn't know the difference. They even use her incompetence as a way to introduce units, because clearly when she has air units to throw at you, now's the time to give us an anti-air unit to counter it. This is a tonal clash that you see throughout, as it seems the game tries to be an uplifting adventure, but then you get to a serious moment and end up with whiplash. In most cases though, the tonal clash can be justified by the side missions, as while there are some levels that you have to complete, there are others which don't directly tie to the main story. Said missions will explain what other characters are doing as the main story presses on, and in doing so, allow the game to tie up loose ends. Since most of these side missions are self-contained or tangential, it's more forgivable for them to be tonally different, and could even be construed as a positive for giving us not just more gameplay variety, but more variety in the story itself. Even then though, some of the absurdity is to a degree that it's hard to ignore even in that self-contained environment. For example, some of the side missions have a Cherrystone commander constantly causing trouble for a group of bandits, which is fine on its own, until you remember that the commander who is barking out orders and hounding these bandits at every turn is a literal dog. An amusing dog, I'll grant you, if only because there are some absolutely hilarious moments on account of his actions, and the fact that none of the named characters seem to be aware of his antics, but it's really jarring to see people treat the good boy as the most horrendous threat to bandits everywhere, when you then compare it to the serious tone you see otherwise. Regardless, the missions do a good job at integrating the gameplay, but the circumstances required for that can be a little contrived, as they invoke the misunderstanding trope more than once in order to make battles happen. That being said, they give just enough reason for why that would happen to where it's not that annoying. In one case, you're up against someone who isn't all that friendly to anyone, and therefore has a vested interest in cultivating conflict, and in another, the people you're up against are less willing to listen as a result of circumstances before you arrived. Because of this, even though the trope has been done to death by this point, and is one I normally dislike as a result, it actually managed to make it work for the places where it's used. What's even better is, that isn't the only time the story caught me by surprise, especially near the end. It's not substantial enough to require a spoiler section, but for people who played Advance Wars, you know how your enemy wasn't actually your enemy by the end of the game? Well, they sorta do that, though not in the way you would expect at first, and there are some pretty serious consequences as those events unfold. I daren't say more than that, so let's distract from the point by mentioning the co-op campaign, which was introduced in February of this year as a free update, and allows you to either play the game with someone else or to figure out how best to manage two armies at once. The story itself is fairly basic, as it follows the adventures of a band of outlaws who are forced to go on rather elaborate heists for someone they care about, but there's just enough personality to the characters to where it's an enjoyable romp. All of the characters from the main campaign are given time to shine in this one as well, and the new arrivals are also a lot of fun to watch. To back it all up, you have a solid soundtrack. Each commander gets their own theme song when it's their turn, and though I have my favorites, all of them fit the commander they play for, whether it be something upbeat and cheerful for the good boy, or ominous and threatening for the leader of Felheim. As for the graphics and animation, they use sprite art throughout, which is really well done. Where the map is concerned, the color palette in the units' animations allow them to stand out well compared to the background, even when the units are a similar color to said background. For the cutscenes, they're fairly simple interactions, with sparse voice acting doing a good job to sell the characters' emotions. Part of me wishes that more of it were voice acted, as it would have been nice to hear more than just an occasional line or gasp here and there, especially with how good some of the line delivery is. But given the art style they went with, I suspect this was a stylistic choice, albeit one I don't necessarily agree with. And when it comes to the combat animations, they look really nice, with a lot of impact built into them. But the only problem is that the examples I have of them are less than numerous. Despite how much time I put into the game, the animations take so long to cycle that I ended up usually skipping over them, which was strange to me because I never remembered that being an issue back in the old days. So, out of curiosity, I played around in Advance Wars 2 and realized why they seemed so much longer than before. Since a lot of the units are melee this time around, that then means there's a few seconds where the unit will physically run up to the enemy before striking, which greatly increases the amount of time you spend watching the animations. You might be able to get around this by removing the dividing wall between the two units, which would shorten the distance melee units have to run, but since you would still need it for units that are far away, and would then need to create special art to merge different terrain types, that would have been a considerable amount of work. Regardless of the reason or the work required to get past it though, the fact that they take so long means, without ignoring said animations, battles feel like they take twice as long to get through, which does negatively affect the pacing. That covers everything I have to say about the story and presentation, so let's switch focus to gameplay, i.e. the part that really sold me on this game. If you've played Advance Wars, you'll be right at home here, as between the resource management, unit composition, and art style, the comparisons are numerous and will be a substantial part of this section. For the unfamiliar, it's a turn-based strategy game where you recruit units, claim territory to increase your resource gain, and then attempt to either defeat every enemy on the field, destroy their stronghold, or defeat their commander. The units themselves are pretty much the same between factions outside of some aesthetic differences, with the primary difference being the commander. Said commander is a really powerful unit who can do a ton of damage to ground units, but if the commander falls, their team loses no matter how well they were doing otherwise. What makes each commander unique is that as they take actions, and especially if they take damage, they will charge a groove. Wait, that's what we're calling it? I mean, I get it when it comes to the name, but you're asking me to take the word groove seriously when every time I say it, I'm expecting Emperor Kuzco to enter stage left. To get back on topic, there's special abilities that help each commander stand out, and range from a turn refresh on all adjacent units, an instant kill that also returns health to the commander, vines that block movement, and plenty more on top of that. Though some of them are more situational, all of them have their own use, and help to differentiate how each commander operates. As for the units themselves, when they enter combat, both sides will attack each other, with the health of each unit determining not just how much damage they can take, but also how powerful their own attacks will be. This is a setup that was introduced with Advance Wars, but adds a lot to the games it's used for. For one thing, sending a unit into an enemy army to take someone out is now a more deliberate choice, as you can't just take a 1-health cavalry unit knowing he's not long for this world, throw him into the enemy army, and expect him to immediately knock over an archer. If you want to make that kind of move, you now have to be willing to sacrifice a full health cavalry unit instead, meaning it's something you only want to do as a first strike before other units follow up, or if you can take out the enemy commander. By virtue of this, you're encouraged to be more aggressive than you would otherwise act in a turn-based strategy game. Normally you're likely to be more cautious, waiting for an opportunity when you can immediately rush the enemy and take out a good chunk of them right off the bat. Here though, even just knocking a unit to half health can deal a serious blow to your enemy's strength, leading to a lot more direct confrontation than otherwise. And when it comes to those confrontations, the unit variety is stellar. Each unit has its own use as battles progress and all have their own strengths and weaknesses, be it increased range, greater movement, effectiveness against a certain unit type, and so on. Though many of you will recognize where a lot of the units come from, what makes them more interesting this time around are the critical hit conditions, as if a unit meets certain criteria, they'll do substantially more damage. For instance, cavalry will do extra damage if they can use their entire movement range of 6 before attacking, while ballistae will critically hit if they attack an enemy that's 2 squares away. In fact, the ballistae are an example of the solid game balance, as while said balance might not have been great on release, at least according to earlier Steam reviews, it's certainly in good shape now. The ballista may have an extremely long range, but having their critical hit spot 2 squares away was a really clever way to balance them. Normally when a ballista attacks anyone other than a flyer, it'll deal about a third of the unit's health, which is substantial but not devastating. However, because of its long range, cavalry and wagons are the only units that can get close to it without ending their turn in the line of fire. And while cavalry can one-shot a ballista in that circumstance, wagons are only useful for transporting other ground units, meaning you can end a friendly unit's turn right next to it, but may end up seeing that ground unit obliterated if the ballista has friends. For every other ground unit, if you're overzealous and get 2 squares away, the ballista can punish you for being reckless, and if you're only 3 squares away, it offers the enemy a chance to either regroup around it or for the unit to retreat. To keep them from being overpowered, however, siege weapons differ from other ground units in that they can't move and attack on the same turn, meaning you can eventually back them into a corner if they aren't well guarded without them being able to effectively retaliate. That then means given the relatively high cost of the unit, they can serve a niche role as an anti-air defense while also picking away at stragglers on the ground, so long as you can maintain the distance between them and their targets. Pretty much every unit can be looked at in this way, including the pikemen who were once the bane of every player's existence. Looking at them now, they don't seem to be that much of a concern, as they cost substantially more than a standard swordsman, are tied with archers for the slowest movement in the game, and therefore can be easily picked off by more expensive units or the commander. However, back when this game released, pikemen cost 150 gold instead of 250, meaning it was a lot easier to mass produce them. Even this might not sound like a problem though, because you can only spawn a single unit from a given barracks, but when you're strapped for cash, even having a swordsman out as a meat shield can make a major difference, hamstringing where the enemy can approach from and allowing your commander time to shine. Especially since the critical hit condition for swordsmen is to stand adjacent to a friendly commander. But then you account for the pikeman's critical hit condition, where they only need to stand next to each other in order to trigger it. That then means you could effectively create a wall of units at a fourth the cost of a cavalry unit that might not be very mobile, but is extremely dangerous. Luckily, by the time I got to this game, the issue had already been addressed, as by raising the price of the unit, it means going out of your way to set that strategy up will take more resources, which given the way units are recruited, gives more opportunities for the enemy to set up a counteroffensive. Be it long-ranged attacks from a trebuchet, air attacks if the enemy wasn't smart enough to recruit some anti-air units, or if you like living dangerously, throwing the commander at the problem. So while it may have taken some time to get the balance right, what's here now is really well done, as pretty much every unit in the game has clear strengths and weaknesses that make them a viable option. To bring out the differences in each unit, you have the solid map design, with plenty of hazards set up to where your unit composition and strategy are heavily influenced by it. Finding a lot of mountains and forests, recruit mages for their high movement and increased damage when in a tile with higher defense. Having to deal with the rare Fog of War map, send out the good boys to scout ahead for relatively cheap and to give you a nice means to deal with stray swordsmen. Have a bottleneck you need to break, send in the siege weapons or archers. On top of that, capturing and holding territory functions drastically different to what you might be used to. There are still a limited number of units who can capture structures, but said structures now act as a unit instead of a terrain type, meaning allies can pass through it, enemies cannot, and no one can occupy the same space. Also, in order to capture them, you need simply move an infantry unit or your commander next to them and use the capture action. That is, unless the enemy has already claimed it, in which case you need to defeat the guard that's stationed there, requiring you to dedicate more than just time to claiming territory. To further add an inherent risk to the move, the starting health of territory you capture will be half the health of the capturing unit, meaning if you haven't already secured the area, it's easy for a stray cavalry unit or pikemen to neutralize it at no risk to themselves. That then means you can end up in a stalemate where you have a territory that you want to claim, but you can't get any benefits from it until the next turn. A fact the AI stubbornly exploits by constantly neutralizing it if they feel it's the best option to hamstring you. And to be fair, sometimes the AI is correct in that assertion, as the units they have out might not be able to capture it or get a fair trade against the units you have out yourself, meaning it makes more sense to limit your income rather than directly engage you. It's a dynamic that I really like, as it adds a lot of risk and reward to going after and exploiting territory. To add even more risk and reward, it's also possible to replenish damaged units by putting them next to friendly buildings. By investing a bit of gold, you can bolster the strength of the unit. But not only is there the cost of your gold reserves, it also reduces the strength of the building by the same amount that's healed, making it easier to neutralize and limiting how quickly you can heal other units. Since territories only replenish 10% of their health on the occupying team's turn, it's something you can technically use regularly, but given the chance of losing the structure by doing that, and the fact that your units might be better off knocking the enemy around instead, it's not a strategy that can be easily abused. In some cases, it may make more sense to recruit a mage, as alongside being effective against air units, they have an active ability that heals allied units by 20% in a cross-shaped pattern. And yes, there are active abilities outside of just throwing off your commander's groove, as one of your air units may only be able to hit other air units, but for 300 gold they can make every enemy unit around them lose 10% of their health, which can be a killing blow. It's not an ability I found myself using all that often, as it was usually better to save that money up for another unit, but given that said damage can be dished out without retaliation, affects a wide area, and can kill low health enemies, it certainly has its use. And I know this is the case because the AI isn't a pushover, and will absolutely exploit that ability if they think it's the most cost-effective strategy, which has made my direct confrontations less than ideal more than once. Sure, the AI isn't a genius, as it can be overly obsessed with attacking your commander at the expense of all reason, alongside stupid moves like moving siege weapons in convenient range of your heavy hitters, but there were multiple times where it either punished me for being reckless, which then forced me to restart a level, or managed to position its units to where they were barely out of range of me, and I couldn't escape their range by the end of my turn. Granted, it's easier to do that when dragons have a movement range of 8, but considering the attack range of 5 that harpoon boats have, and the fact that I had multiple flyers on the field, that's a feat I honestly didn't expect, and meant I had to rethink my strategy in terms of the damage that dragon would dish out. However, there is one thing that for anyone who played Advanced Wars is conspicuous by its absence: the commander's effect on the army itself. Back in ye olden days when commanders didn't actively participate, they instead participated through their special abilities and by passive effects to their entire army, such as increased effectiveness with a certain kind of unit. This then meant while there wasn't a unique and super powerful unit, there was still a clear distinction in how each commander operates and what they're good at, which would also have a major effect when you have to choose between them. However, with the commanders on the field now, that passive effect was left behind, to where it's much easier to swap commanders in and out. As a result, there's no tactical difference between a pikeman led by Mercia compared to a dreadspear led by the leader of Felheim, to where despite the units technically having their own name and appearance, I can interchangeably refer to them by the same name and you would instantly know what I'm talking about. Because of this, commanders may still have an effect, but it's much more localized to their spot on the map to where, in cases like this map where they're not in play, it doesn't matter who I'm using, because it wouldn't make a difference in how the battle plays out. In this game's defense, however, there are a couple of reasons for why you might not want this feature. For one thing, it can cause potential confusion as to how powerful a given unit actually is, as now an archer is not just an archer anymore. Especially since there isn't necessarily an easy way to convey this until you start swinging, there's reason to say that you get a more, for lack of a better word, pure experience without it. As in this case, it comes down purely to your wits instead of whether you misjudged how much more powerful the other guy's pikemen would be. For another, with how much the game was already lifting from Advanced Wars, there may have been concerns that they were emulating it a little too closely. As outside of some differences in naval combat, literally every unit can be compared to a unit from the days of yore. As a result, having the commander directly interact instead of passively interact may have been seen as a way to sidestep those concerns, to help the game stand on its own. This is especially the case given the increased mission variety, as there are some missions where you don't do any recruitment at all and have to work with a limited number of units. In cases like that, if you have something like, say, increased effectiveness with cavalry and war pups for the good boy, that could have a significant effect on the missions where it's just him and a small team of ground units. And yet, even with this in mind, I think it would have been better to keep the passive effects, alongside letting the commander directly interact, as it helps sell the difference between the armies beyond just their appearance, and because, at least for me, originality isn't as important as efficacy. You can have the most original, most ambitious, most incredible idea known to man, but until you can demonstrate it as such, you're going to have a hard time selling it. And in the case of this game, do I care that much if the core gameplay was heavily inspired by another? No, because for one thing, we don't get a whole lot of games like this nowadays, and two, if it's really well made, why wouldn't I want more of a thing that I already like? Regardless, where the gameplay is concerned, that's my only complaint, as the rest of it is really well designed, with a solid user interface to ensure it's never cumbersome to play. That being said, I'll admit it felt weird at first to play a game like this with keyboard and mouse. It's something I'm grateful for, as it means a unit is a flick of the wrist away instead of a long scroll away, but it takes some getting used to. Also, if you're using a mouse, the action menu is a little small, as it was really easy to accidentally hit wait instead of taking another action, but that's the only issue I've run into for keyboard and mouse. And even if you want to use a controller, either out of sheer preference or because you bought it for a console, it's still as usable as you would expect. The only quality of life improvements I would hope for is a change to when the game automatically ends your turn. If you move every unit and recruit someone from everywhere that's physically possible, the game will end your turn automatically, which is certainly appreciated. However, once the battle starts to escalate and you've saved up enough gold for a heavy hitter to where you don't have any more gold to spend, even moving all of your units doesn't automatically end your turn. It's a nitpick, as it only becomes annoying during the late game when you might want to double check your units anyway, but there were multiple times where I went, hang on, didn't I move everyone? And had. That covers everything with respect to the game itself, so let's talk about the different game modes. To start, there's the campaign, which is where the majority of my time with this game was spent, and does a good job at slowly incrementing the number of units you have at your disposal, and giving you interesting circumstances in which each unit would be viable. They also throw in a small number of battles where you can't recruit units, which create interesting scenarios where you have to be mindful of when to engage, which adds a great deal of variety between the missions. Beyond that, the co-op campaign plays out much differently compared to the main one. With the original campaign, the battles are consistently focused on defeating your opponent or reaching a given destination, and while they can vary things up with new units, new commanders, and plenty of unique circumstances, you never have to worry about your units being spread out over more than one turn. However, regardless of whether you play the co-op campaign by yourself or with a friend, now you have to worry about some of your army moving on one turn, with the remainder moving on another. Personally, the fact that this was the case is understandable, as it allows you to play it co-op, but when playing it alone, it can be obnoxious to account for. Even for missions in the campaign where you have multiple commanders and armies at your disposal, everyone is operating on the same turn, which makes it much easier to coordinate. Now though, that isn't necessarily the case, which admittedly does add some interesting strategies, such as moving a unit from player 2's army using a transport from player 1, which allows player 2 to effectively move twice. That being said, having to cycle through two armies, especially given the small period where they confirm which control scheme you're using, does drag the pacing down a little bit. So if you can play it co-op, I strongly recommend it, as having someone else to strategize with will definitely help distract from the problem. That being said, everything else within the co-op campaign was really well set up. To start, they added 2 new units, which are only recruitable from a new tent-looking structure. The Thief can't attack enemies, but can immediately neutralize a structure, and then return to a tent in order to give you 300 gold. What makes this a gamble is that the Thief is very easy to take down, and while they move very quickly normally, and neutralizing a structure is nothing to sneeze at, they only have a movement of 3 until they can haul the gold off, making it easier to pick them off. I didn't use them too often due to the initial gold cost, and because with how I play there weren't that many situations where I needed to immediately neutralize a structure, but for its ability to make you wary of where a thief might go and what he might do to hamstring your income, it's certainly useful. The other unit, the Marksman, uses a flintlock rifle to fire in one of the cardinal directions. However, they operate like siege weapons, in that they can't attack if they choose to move, and as a unique restriction, they can only fire 3 times before needing to spend a turn reloading. That then makes them a high-risk, high-rewards unit that's effective for tearing up infantry from afar, but are easily killed the moment a unit is able to bridge the gap. These units help add some much-needed variety to the missions, as given the circumstances, you're only playing the 2 outlaw commanders throughout. And this is on top of the missions already being pretty varied, with all of them requiring clever thinking to make it. Each heist can be played in whatever order you wish, and it seems they're about comparable in terms of difficulty, but what makes it work is that they're challenging for different reasons that I refuse to spoil. All I'll say is that they fit well with the characters you're up against, create a different circumstance where the goal isn't to win a straight up fight, but instead to grab and run, and can even add some interesting puzzle solving to the mix as well. Speaking of puzzle solving, that's another game mode, as there's 25 maps where you're tasked with completing an objective within a single turn. As such, you'll need to utilize the full extent of your units in order to win. Just bear in mind that the order in which they appear isn't necessarily in order from most to least difficult, as either my mind just doesn't work the way the developers expected, or I'm an idiot for not being able to figure out something as basic as this. I mean, Emmerich's Groove will allow alchemists to critically hit within its range, drastically increasing their damage, but it seems like to succeed, I need to get both cavalry to critically hit, followed up with an attack by the good boys. But in order to get that critical hit, I can't seem to do it without the cherry stone blocking someone's path to said crit. Knowing my luck, I'll either have figured it out by the time this video is uploaded, or someone will leave a comment telling me the solution after a cleverly worded insult. At least I can say I figured out most of them, right? Over half of them is technically most, right? I'm never gonna unlock the rest of the concept art. Before we get into that, there's also the arcade mode, which pits you in a series of 5 battles, each one set on a pseudo-random 2-player map that you would find in the game's Skirmish mode. I haven't tried it out on easy mode, but normal is pretty much standard fare, putting you on an even keel with the AI, and it's pretty easy to complete as a result, with hard mode doubling the enemy's income gain, and therefore creating a circumstance where your intelligence as a human is brought to bear against the AI's greater resources. As a result of the cash difference, the hard mode is more difficult than you might expect, though that could just be because I've grown used to modern Fire Emblem's undo button, and therefore take way too many risks with my commander. Honestly, I can think of only one time when I was defeated by the enemy destroying my stronghold instead of defeating my commander, in large part because I like to use my commander aggressively, and that can be troublesome when I fail to remember they're in range of a dragon. However, while the challenge can be interesting, and it does create a neat way to check out the skirmish maps, it ends up being very repetitive, and once you figured out how the AI tends to work in a given map, it ends up becoming relatively easy to exploit. Perhaps if the commanders were more varied, and if the AI varied their strategy up a little more, instead of reliably picking the same units, I'd be singing a different tune. But as it is, the game mode is a little too repetitive for my liking. Which is a shame because the stars that mark your progress are used as a barrier to entry for the final battle in the single-player campaign, and can be redeemed in the extras menu to check out some of the concept art that went into this game's development. You also earn stars from doing well in the campaign and completing puzzles, with the latter being relatively simple, and the former being somewhat inconsistent, as it seems the only barometer for the ranks are how many turns it takes you to win, irrespective of how messy or otherwise you end up being. It's mostly ancillary, but it's nice to see a game that gives you unlockables the old-fashioned way, even if they don't have an effect on the game itself. I'm sure if I care enough I can look them up online, but then again if I wanted the solutions to the puzzles I could have looked those up too. And since I refuse on principle to do that, here I am basking in my shame. Oh, and one other thing before I move on. If you're defeated, it's possible to keep going on the same map as much as you want so long as you hit the retry button instead of the exit button. However, because I would normally hit the exit button when I lost in order to take a break or try out something else, for a long time I thought you had to win all 5 rounds consecutively. And there is video evidence of me getting to the last level with a couple of commanders, flubbing it, and then losing all that progress. As for whether failing to recognize that was an understandable mistake or a moment where I went full game journalist, I'll leave that up to you. With that said, that leaves us with one final section, specifically the multiplayer tab, which sadly doesn't have a lot of activity, both when I first bought the game and when I went hunting for footage. There's usually at least 1 or 2 lobbies at any given time, so you can usually find someone to play against, but since I haven't found that many games, it's not something I can speak with authority on. The good news is that it's possible for you to trade turns back and forth asymmetrically, meaning if you need to leave the game and see to something else, you can pick back up where you left off once it's your turn. That also means you can have multiple games going at once, giving you a few minutes a day to play your turns without having to worry about your opponent's patience. Within this section, you'll also find the game's skirmish mode, which is kind of a weird place for it to be. Honestly, the entire main menu is strange the more I think about it. The main single-player area is labeled story but contains both the puzzles and the arcade mode, which do rely on the characters but doesn't really have much of a plot, at least one that doesn't contradict the main game. And yet the skirmish mode is tucked away under the multiplayer section, even though when you're setting up the players for a local match, you can assign a team to the AI and treat it like single player. I'm wondering if it would have been more intuitive to rename the story section single player and give you a choice to set up skirmish matches there, and only if you want to do multiplayer go into the other tab. To be fair though, that could end up being even more confusing, as now you have two completely different paths to reach a functionally identical location, which might be why they went with this. But it then means the skirmish mode where you can do AI battles is also tucked away within the multiplayer section. Either way, I haven't spent a whole lot of time in the skirmish mode either, but they do have a decent amount of map variety. Whether it be scenarios for 2, 3, or 4 teams, maps wholly dedicated to naval combat, and even some scenarios that are co-op versus AI. And just for fun, they created a chessboard, set a rule that you can only move 1 unit per turn on that map, and then arranged units to look like the start of a chess match. It's the only novelty map in here so far as I can tell, unless you want to grab something from the internet, but it's still a neat little map in case you want to goof off with something different. To close this section out, there's also a place where you can create and download custom maps, scenarios, and even entire campaigns. Bear in mind, however, that I usually don't include such material when considering a final verdict, as if I were to judge a game based on player-created content, any review I make could easily boil down to this game has X, Y, and Z wrong with it, but the community fixed it, so 10 out of 10. However, I will give kudos to the fact that the tools you need to make and share custom content are built into the game itself, meaning there's very little if any tinkering that needs to be done outside of the game to create interesting scenarios. Also, if you have friends that bought the game on a console while you bought it for PC, you can still check out their custom content and play against them online, with these icons letting you know the platform that your friends and opponents are using. Overall, Wargroove may not be the most original game, given the sheer amount of inspiration taken from Advanced Wars, but it manages to throw its own spin onto it that, with some exceptions, is a direct improvement. There are certain things I wish had been kept, such as passive effects on your army, but the ability to use your commander on the field, alongside the solid game balance, map design, AI, and more, make it a game that's really fun to play, especially if you've been pining for a game like this. If you're interested, you can find it on PC and every major console. With that said, that's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for more reviews as well as other content posted on a semi-regular basis. Also, out of curiosity, can anyone tell me why so many people make comparisons to Fire Emblem for this game? On a surface level, they're pretty similar, as it's a fantasy turn-based strategy game where the protagonist's father dies, but apart from that, I don't really see the connection, and this is after taking way too long to talk about the latest entry in the franchise. Tonally speaking, it's a much different beast, and while they're both strategy games, they take very different approaches to the genre. Regardless, for my next review, I've got a couple of ideas on the chopping block. One of them is to return to the RPG well, as there are a couple of games I recently finished that I'm looking forward to discussing, or to torture myself with another 2+ hour review, this time focusing on a little thing that's still being released onto PC. I'm sure I'll have a decision made within the next week or two, so if you're curious to see what that decision ends up being, please consider hitting the notifications bell, as that'll let you know the moment I have another video out. With that said, thank you all once again for watching, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you all later.